year's professional development keynote. Dr. Fitzpatrick, may I turn this Zoom mic over to you?
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Allison and Kirby, for inviting me and welcoming me into this meeting today. And thank you for that introduction, which really helps set up, I think, a fair bit of what I'm going to do today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I've got some slides. The slides are not bullet points, right? So there's not a whole lot of text on them. So once I share the screen, you might, if you can put me and the slides side by side in your view and make me as big as the slides. It's a helpful way of sort of seeing the points that I'm making without getting to lost in what are ultimately just pretty simple slides. So thank you again for letting me join you. I am really sorry not to be with you in San Diego. It is, as I was telling the team when we first got on the call, an absolutely gorgeous sunny day here in mid-Michigan, but it is 25 degrees. And I would be delighted to be in San Diego right now, but I am really happy to get a chance to talk with you a little bit about generous thinking. Much of what I'm going to talk about today does derive from the arguments in the book. And I wanted to first just point out the subtitle of the book, A Radical Approach to Saving the University. The saving the university part of that subtitle really has to do with my growing conviction that the survival of institutions of higher education, and this is especially true of institutions of public higher education in the United States, that survival is really going to require those of us who work on campus to change some of our approaches to the work that we do on campus and to the ways that we use that work to connect the campus to the many publics that the university serves. Now, the radical approach bit grows out of my increasing sense that the necessary change that I'm talking about is a huge one, right? That it can't just be made incrementally. As Chris Newfield notes in the conclusion of his book, The Great Mistake, this kind of change really requires a paradigm shift because there's no easy path. There's no simple tool that can readily take us from where the university is today to where we need it to be. As Tressie McMillan Cottom has noted of the crisis in higher education, this is not a problem for technological innovation or a market product. This requires politics. I mean, the problem, after all, begins with politics. The American public university that not too long ago served as a highly accessible engine of social mobility, making a rich liberal arts-based education broadly available, has been undone. We're facing today not just the drastic reduction in that institution's affordability, but an increasing threat to its very public orientation, as rampant privatization not only shifts the burden of paying for higher education from the state to students and families, but also turns the purpose of the institution from the creation of a shared social good, right, a broadly educated population ready to participate in building a better world, to instead focus on the production of market-oriented individual benefit. And all the while, we're also facing what Inside Higher Ed has described as a larger than typical decline in confidence in an American institution in a relatively short time period. And this falling confidence in our universities shouldn't simply be dismissed as evidence of an increasingly entrenched anti-intellectualism in American life, though we could argue that that absolutely exists. Instead, though, we really need to examine the degree to which higher education has, for the last several decades, operated simultaneously under two conflicting paradigms defining its importance for American culture. On the one hand, there's an older paradigm, one that's largely operative within the academic community, in which the university serves as a producer and disseminator of knowledge. And on the other hand, there's a more recent paradigm, one that circulates more broadly throughout the economy, in which the university serves as a producer and disseminator of credentials. Right? And those two things are in conflict. And even worse than the conflict between them is that both of those paradigms are failing right now, if in different ways. And the argument that I'm making is that if our institutions are to thrive in the decades ahead, we have to find a new way to articulate and live out the value of the university in the contemporary world. So the book overall makes the argument that building a relationship of trust between the public university and the public that it serves requires regrounding the university in a mode of what I refer to as generous thinking, focusing our research and our pedagogical practices around building community and solidarity both on campus and across the campus borders. And this generous thinking requires concerted effort to make clear that the real good of higher education is and must be understood as social rather than individual. So generous thinking asks us to consider how we work with one another on campus and how we connect our campuses to the publics around us. It begins by understanding generosity as a mode of engagement grounded in listening to one another and to the publics with whom we work, attempting to understand their concerns as deeply as possible before leaping forward to our critiques and solutions. The book goes on to explore ways that critical reading practices, such as those we enact on campus every day, might be opened up to foster greater engagement between scholars and other readers, right? Creating means for those readers to see more of the ways that scholars work and the reasons for those methods, but also creating means for scholars to learn more about why general interest readers read the way they do. Building key bridges between two reading communities that too often seem to speak past one another. I also spend time in the book thinking about the ways and the reasons that scholars might do more of their work in public, and publishing in openly accessible venues and in more publicly accessible registers, and developing more community engaged research in order to bring the university's resources to bear in helping work through community concerns, as well as helping to transform those communities from passive recipients of the university's knowledge into active collaborators in shared projects. But if we're going to make the kinds of changes that I argue for in the ways that scholars work, both on campus and off, the university as an institution must undergo a fairly radical transformation, becoming the kind of institution that supports rather than dismisses, or in fact at times actively punishes, collaboration and community engagement. The university must become the kind of institution that can focus less on individual achievement, on educating for individual leadership, and that can focus instead on building community, and indeed on educating for community building. And this requires a radical rethinking of the reward structures of higher education, right? What we value and how we demonstrate that we value it. Our universities are in many ways structured as collectives, right, in which each member of the institution is charged with some part of the well-being of the whole. And this is how we derive our principles of shared governance, for instance, that suggests that we each have a contribution to make to the operation of the institution. And yet, when we look at the kinds of work for which folks on campus are actively rewarded, as well as the nature of the rewards that they receive for that work, we repeatedly find an emphasis on the individual rather than on the whole. So for instance, for faculty at large research universities like yours or like mine, the work for which we are most rewarded is our research, the kind of work that we pointedly refer to as our own work. And the rewards that we receive for doing that work often wind up pulling us away from the collective, So if I publish a well-received book or an article in a prestigious journal, I might be eligible for a course release or for relief from service responsibilities on campus. And all of the other possible rewards that I might seek, promotions, raises, all of those kinds of things, encourage me to retreat from membership in the university community and instead focus on my own work, the research for which rewards are given. And this is part and parcel of the hyper-individualistic orientation of the contemporary university, in which every form of merit, including grades, credits, honors, degrees, rank, status, and more, every form of merit is determined by what I individually have done, even where I've done that work collaboratively. Now, add to that the situation of most institutions of higher education today, in which austerity-based thinking leads us to understand that merit is always limited, right? And thus, your success or your distinction, your accomplishments can only come at my expense. And the result is that we find ourselves in a kind of zero-sum game in which we have to compete with one another, right? For attention or for acclaim or for resources or for time. We're trapped on a quest for what Thorstein Veblen described as invidious distinction, in which we separate ourselves from others by climbing over one another. Now, it's important to note that this situation applies just as much to the institutions that we work for as to the individuals who work within them. And insofar as the structures within our institutions privilege achievement through competition, it's because our institutions are similarly under a mandate, as Chris Newfield has said, to compete all the time. And it's only when our institutions are able to distance themselves from the rankings and from other quantified metrics for excellence that pit them against one another, that those of us who work on campus will likewise be able to move fully away from competitive thinking and into a mode that's more generous. And this is no easy task, right? Over the course of the last several years, both while generous thinking was in press and after it was published, I had the opportunity to speak on a number of college and university campuses where faculty, staff, students, and administrators were all thinking together about how to create and support a greater sense of connection between, within the campus community, but also between the campus community and the university's public-facing mission. The folks who invited me ranged from the officers of campus AAUP chapters to university presidents and their advisors, and all of them felt a connection with the arguments in generous thinking, not least because they recognized that their institutions require not just better strategic plans, but deep culture change. And that culture change demands, among other things, a serious rethinking of how we work, why we work the way we do, how we assess and reward that work, and how we recognize as work things that tend to get dismissed as service, but that play a crucial role in building and sustaining collaborative communities. But Generous Thinking as a book focused pretty tightly on the why and the what of the changes that our university cultures need to make. And it spent a whole lot less time on how. For instance, it's clear that making a better, more sustainable institution requires us to move in some sense away from individualistic ideas of meritorious production, right? To step off of the Fordist production line that forever asks us to do more, and instead to think together in a humane fashion about ways that we can do better. Right? Better often, in fact, requires slowing down, right? Talking with our colleagues in our communities, and most importantly, listening to what others have to say. Better requires engagement and connection and sharing in ways that more nearly always encourages us to rush past. So turning from more to better can help us access the pleasures and indeed the joys that of our work, that life on the production line has required us to kind of push aside. But making that change goes against some of the deeply ingrained ways of working that have come to seem utterly natural to us in the university setting. And it's super unclear how we might even begin to make such a change. So I was already thinking that I needed to follow up generous thinking with something that would dig a bit deeper into the how of transformation. And then after one of the talks I gave, an attendee asked me a question that made the stakes of thinking about how painfully clear. Her question's been stuck in my head ever since, and it's certainly been rolling around in there a lot since March. She asked, generosity is all well and good, right? And it's something that's relatively easy to embrace when resources are plentiful. But how do we practice generosity in hard times? Can we afford to think generously when we're facing significant budget cuts, for instance? Or is it inevitable that we fall back into analytics-driven competition with every unit on campus, much less every worker, out to protect their own resources and their own privileges? Now, I don't remember how I answered then. I suspect it was some combination of saying you're completely right, that's the real question, and pointing out that the difficulties involved in being generous in hard times are precisely why we need to practice generosity in a determined way in good times. And I may have said some things about the importance of transparency and priority setting and decision making and of involving the collective in that process. But I do know that as I stood there saying whatever it was I said, I was thinking, wow, this is hard. I don't know. I don't know how we find the wherewithal to remain generous when times are bad, except by having practiced generosity enough to have developed some individual and institutional muscle memory, and by recommitting ourselves to our values again and again. And I especially don't know how we remain generous at a moment when our institutions are approaching us, right? We who work for them, as well as we who rely on them, invoking the notion of the shared sacrifice that's needed to keep the institution running. I don't know how, because I do want the institution to survive, and I want to sustain the community that it enables. But I also know that the sacrifices that are called for are never genuinely equitably distributed. And I also know that however much I might want to keep the institution running, the institution is not thinking the same thing about me. Our institutions will not, cannot love us back, right? However much we sacrifice for them, they will never sacrifice for us. And this understanding was first clarified for me again by Tressie McMillan Cottom, who posted a Twitter thread describing the advice that she gives to Black scholars who ask her how to survive in the academy. And one point in that thread stuck with me. I don't think these institutions can support us or love us. And I honor the many, many people who work to make them more humane. But you alone cannot do that. And you cannot do it ever by killing yourself. Now, this is especially true for members of minoritized groups, pardon me, working within the academy. It's especially true for faculty without tenure. It's especially true for staff. It's especially true for scholars working in contingent positions. It's especially true for everyone whose positions in the hierarchies of prestige and comfort leave them vulnerable, especially at moments when "we're all in it together" is invoked not in the context of resource sharing, but of sacrifice. Right? Sacrifice tends to roll downhill and to accelerate in the process. And this is how we end up with furloughs and layoffs among contract faculty and staff at the same time that we find ourselves with a new associate vice president for shared sacrifice. So the only way to prevent such sacrifice from rolling downhill is to build channels to build structures to channel it otherwise. And this is the deepest goal of generous thinking, and by extension of the follow-up project that I'm working on now, which is tentatively entitled Leading Generously. In this project, I'm focusing on how we can work collectively to build a more generous environment in which we can do our work together. So what kinds of leadership are required for us to make the university into an institution that is structurally capable of living up to its duty of care for all of its members in good times and bad? Leading Generously is in some ways intended to be a practical handbook for sort of putting the ideas of generous thinking into action. But in doing so, it asks its readers to reconsider some basic concepts that underwrite big structural change. It proposes that despite the enormity of the transformation that higher education needs today, a transformation that is large enough to require a revolution, local changes can begin to make a difference, and that we are capable of making those local changes. Now, among the concepts that demand reconsideration in this process, however, is the very notion of leadership itself. Right? We conventionally associate leadership with the folks at the top of an institutional hierarchy, those with the authority to steer the ship. Well, while I hope that Leading Generously might speak to them, the project addresses everyone on campus, beginning with the argument that everyone in an institution has the potential to be a leader, to create local transformative change that can model ways of being that others might learn from and join in with. And this conviction places a lot of emphasis on individual actors, right, in ways that might seem to be a bit at odds with some of today's most important ideas about how power operates. Those critical ideas, including arguments about race and racism, arguments about sex, gender, and misogyny, about class and power, those ideas understand that issues that they explore to be systemic rather than individual. And that is to say, they argue that real change requires social transformation. It requires building institutions, creating governments, enacting laws, transforming economies in ways that work toward equity rather than supporting privilege. I'm convinced by these arguments, and I have that same end goal, right? Building institutions that are structurally capable of supporting and facilitating the work of creating better communities and a better world. But the institutions we have today aren't going to transform themselves. The key to this problem is where we locate agency. Who has the power to start the process of making significant change in the world? If we understand power as residing in the structures and systems that govern our lives, there's little agency left to the individual. And it's unquestionably true that the structural problems we face are enormous, and that one individual can't do much to reshape the world. But groups of individuals can. And building those groups starts with individuals who decide to do more, to put what agency they do have to work in solidarity with others. And so Leading Generously begins with you, where you are. It starts from the position that each of us is equipped to make change in the aspects of our institutions over which we have some influence, and that these changes can model new modes of being within our communities. But it recognizes as well that none of us can get far alone. To transform a complex organization, we need to build coalitions, and we need to act with the collective firmly in view. And because of this requirement, it's important to recognize that the object of leadership, the thing that's being led, is not institutions, but people, right? Bringing them together and helping them organize for change. Building a more generous, deeper sense of us asks us to focus our attention on our relationships with our colleagues and with our broader communities, ensuring that we maintain the humanity, not just of those we work with and for, but of the structures through which we connect with one another. And the key to transforming our institutions then is shoring up these means of moving from you to us. Right? The means of building the coalitions and collectives required to transform our institutions and to make them capable of the kind of community-oriented thinking that we most need today. Now, along the way, we need to consider what we can gain from becoming better listeners, from learning to sit with difficult conversations and even criticism, from assessing our work and the work of those around us based on our deepest values, from cultivating an atmosphere of mutual and renewable trust, and so on. And each of the key concepts that I explore in Leading Generously, listening, vulnerability, values, trust, support, and more, is deceptively simple, but with careful consideration can become the foundation for a practice of community building, for thinking through institutional processes and policies, and ensuring that they serve the people for whom the institution operates. The necessity of that practice is clear. Our institutions cannot survive the crises that we all currently face unless the people and the relationships that make up the institution thrive. Budgets and bottom lines matter, but without its people, without the students, the staff, the faculty, the community, the university is nothing. And that's the thing that we need to understand now more than ever. And the thing that the amazing program that you have in front of you today is working toward, right? The recognition that the primary work of the university is connection. And that in hard times, the most generous thing we can do is to connect with ourselves and everyone we work with so that we all might develop the collective strength necessary to return and rebuild. So thank you so much for having me here today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fitzpatrick. I know that if you were here on campus, you would be receiving a large round of applause. I'm sure we'd all be staring and cheering. So we'll from our living rooms. But thank you so much. And to our attendees, we are lucky enough to have Dr. Fitzpatrick here for a Q&A session. So please submit your questions in the Q&A. The box below, but I do want to just say that this idea has been huge for us in 2020 as we are collaborating both with new projects and old, and having to collaborate across platforms that none of us are used to. Mm-hmm. So this idea of generous thinking we used all last year while we were planning our strategic plan, and now we really are putting in the work to practice it. So thank you, because it is really it has been really helpful. So we really appreciate it.
Thank you.
A question that we had was, to get started, if you're ready.
I'm ready.
What is maybe an example of generous thinking in your a day-to-day setting, in the office or in a meeting, or when you're collaborating with others? Mm-hmm. Put it into context for other folks.
Sure. The example that I'm going to give grows out of some of my experiences as a faculty member. And this is an experience that I've had in the classroom, that I'm sure all of you have had in the classroom. It's an experience that I have in meetings all the time. And some of it is sort of specific to the university environment, but it's also kind of typical, I think, of US culture pretty broadly right now, which is to say that, how to put this, in a meeting, in a seminar experience, in other kinds of classroom experiences, we have a tendency to approach ideas that other people put out on the table, starting from no, but, right? Like we can't do that. Or like, I hear you, but how about that? Like we have a tendency to start from disagreement and to push back against the ideas of one another. And that tendency toward disagreement develops for a whole lot of really good reasons. One of them is the spirit of critique in which the liberal arts operates. You put forward an idea in an article or in a talk, and I kind of push back on it and say, yes, but what about? How did you come up with this idea? Maybe have you ever thought about it from this perspective? And on the one hand, that collective work of pushing back does help to move ideas forward. But on the other hand, it does so by a kind of disagreement that can very often become competitive and pugilistic. And where I've seen that most clearly has been in graduate school. where, you know, we all knew as graduate students that we were competing on some level for the faculty's time and attention. And then we were going to be competing later on for jobs on the job market. And then we were going to be competing to make sure that I was the one who got the fellowship that would allow me to go up for tenure and so forth, right? That we're constantly looking to make sure that our ideas are the ones that get heard so that we can be the ones who are recognized as having the right ideas and pushing a subject forward. And this is where, you know, the idea of instead of in generous thinking, of rather than working, sorry, my brain just went kerflooey for a second. Rather than pressing our ideas forward by disagreeing with one another and by tearing one another's ideas down, that there's a way of doing so through a yes and mentality, right? By accepting an idea that's been put on the table and saying, that's a really interesting idea. I really like that. And I think that if we were to look at it from this perspective, we could see that we could move it forward in this way. And that little shift from a sort of no but or even a yes but to a yes and really makes the collectivity of what we're doing together clear, and that we have to be operating in conversation with one another in order for these ideas to develop. So that's one key way that, you know, I see in meetings and I see in classrooms when we can all collectively make sure that we're operating from that position of yes and, we tend to have more productive, more engaging, smarter conversations that are not about being the smartest one in the room, but demonstrating how much smarter we all are together.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think it's interesting. We are getting a good amount of questions, you know, surrounding this idea of putting it into practice and what this implementation looks like and how how we can do that as staff members and with our colleagues, because I would you know, go out on a limb and say that all of us really obviously support this idea. It's just how do we get it into practice? And I think that's why we really are excited to have you here. And with that being said, you know, we have a question around, you know, someone really wants to apply this idea of leading generously, but what about the challenge of maybe navigating some upper politics that might be a little bit of a roadblock, but I'm sure we can still make it happen. Is there any advice for some of our colleagues who are submitting questions around that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that we hear on campus all the time in my position, again, as a faculty member in a department, is like, oh, we would love to do that thing completely differently from how we do it now, but the dean will never let us. Right? Or the provost will never let us. Like we would love to be able to promote you based on this digital project that you've done, but the dean says it has to be a book, so you've got to publish a book, sorry. In fact, as it turns out, the dean and the provost don't care all that much about the form that the scholarship takes. They want the department to have a well-articulated vision of what excellence in research is. And they want to be able to be sure that the department is following its own guidelines for assessing that research. And the job of the administration is very often to make sure that the processes are being followed as they're supposed to, rather than saying, you know, no, English professors almost publish books, right? So finding ways to look at the thing that you want to change and say, okay, I can build a coalition here locally that we can begin to shift this part of that policy or that process to make it more generous, to make it more open, and to make it produce a better place to work for all of us. But once we've revised that policy, we're going to have to get it approved by this next step up the ladder. The point, the key element of that relationship is making sure that you know, like, what are the concerns of that point up the ladder, not what you think those concerns are, right? But what they actually are, and seeing if you can find ways to, frankly, kind of mentor up to make the point that if we transform this thing, our students will be happier, our staff will be happier, we will have a more productive and less contentious environment around whatever it is. And for that reason, it's important for the folks up the chain to understand the value of the thing that's being transformed. So it requires negotiation, right? It requires a bit of mentoring up. But it also requires a lot of willingness to listen, to find out where the actual concerns up the chain are, and how to navigate that in ways that allow the transformation to go forward, and to inspire more transformation as it goes on, right? So my dean has been working on some fairly serious revisions of our faculty review processes, of the review processes for tenure and promotion. And this is a thing that a lot of provosts might be super skeptical about, but he's been able to demonstrate that with these new policies, the public perception of the faculty has improved, the quality of the work and of the faculty has radically improved, and the morale of the faculty has improved dramatically. And that all makes an enormous difference. So I will stop there.
Thank you for that. As I was listening to you speak, it is we have to have been really creative this year, and I think that coming to our team members and our colleagues with solution-based answers, really having to solve these problems that we did not anticipate even seeing anytime ever. I think that's where this idea of generous thinking really comes in, because it's not only, collaborating, but it's also working together to say, okay, now we really need to think 5 steps ahead, because we never have had to think like this before. And let's see what problems we are going to face. I think that can really set you apart and set you further. So thank you for that answer, because I think it kind of touches on that. And I know that this group in student affairs specifically is just so creative and collaborative. So I hope they can take that in practice. Another question from one of our attendees is, what is your best piece of advice for putting generous thinking in action on a daily basis in an environment that has an embedded culture? And a bonus point, how do you not drain all your energy doing this work?
Oh my goodness, that is an enormous question, and it's a really super important one, because it is possible to absolutely wear yourself out in this process. I am thinking, sorry, brain went off on a little tangent there for a second and realized I'm not going to be able to make the point I was trying to make. I'm going to go a different direction. I think that it is extremely important for people who are attempting to do transformative work, who are really attempting to change a culture of any variety, to recognize that you can't do it alone, and you can't kill yourself doing it. And that's Tressie McMillan Cottom's point, right? Is that you can bash your head against this wall and the wall is not going to go away, but you might give yourself a really bad headache in the process. If you're going to dismantle the wall, you need to really think with other people about how to take the wall apart, rather than just running yourself into it over and over again. And you need to be prepared to take care of yourself in the process. And I think that's one of the keys, is that particularly folks who are involved in issues where they're trying to build a better world, where they've got like a really mission-driven focus, we have a tendency to wear ourselves out and to hit a point at which we're unable to continue the work. And it's far more important to take the time when we need it, to step back and to take care of ourselves in order to return to the fight and to return to the kinds of work that we need to do to change a culture, renewed and able to move forward. One of the most devastating parts of the last 9 months has really been that no one has gotten any kind of a break at all. My own position at MSU is a 12-month position, but even my faculty friends who were on 9-month contracts did not have a summer away from the university and its issues. We were all in meetings all summer. We were all desperately rebuilding courses for new frameworks that we've never delivered them through before. And it's left everyone now at the end of the fall semester seriously burned out and really in danger of not being able to continue doing the work in the spring in the most open-hearted possible way. So I think it's particularly as we're going into the break between semesters right now. Are y'all on a quarter system? So yeah, I don't know where you are in that
yes.
break right now, but like classes ended for us last week. This is finals week. And I'm feeling all of my colleagues like preemptively anxious about the fact that they've only got 3 or 4 weeks now in order to rebuild their spring classes. And so they're going to end up working like crazy over the break, when it's far more important to step away and to take the time to rest and recover, and not just for, you know, themselves and their own health, but for their relationships with the other faculty and with the staff and with the students that we're going to be working with in the spring, to come back to that that work with them in a way that is that has the wherewithal to be generous, right? So it sounds contradictory to say on some level that being generous requires those moments of stepping back and taking care of yourself. But I think it's absolutely necessary. And I do hope that all of you and all of us are able to take the time we need to regenerate the strength we need to keep going.
Thank you for that. I think many of our team members in CAPS would say, you know, the best way to be an ally and to fight the good fight is, you know, to really take time and make sure that you're the best version of yourself, and that you can do that in the best way that you can, and that starts with taking care of yourself. And kind of going off of that, I know a lot of our student affairs colleagues feel that, you know, they're during the past 9 months and even prior, many are, you know, asked to step up and do much of this socio-emotional work and all similar things. And how can student affairs colleagues manage that, if you have any advice, but also bringing this idea of generous culture and leadership and thinking to others across the institution who we want to collaborate with? If maybe you have kind of a selling point for us to this idea.
I hope I do. I mean, from my experiences working with folks in student affairs, and here at MSU, I mean, this place is so enormous, I haven't had much of an ability to work with folks in student affairs, but I started my career at Pomona College, so not far up the road from y'all. And it was a small place, and I knew everybody in student affairs. We were this little pretty bubble, and everybody was on campus. And so, you know, I got to see the interactions between the members of the student affairs team and the students. And it has always struck me that there was no more generous team on campus than the folks who were doing that work with student affairs. And in no small part because they were the ones who saw up front, really close and personally, what it was our students needed in order to be able to thrive on campus. The faculty, we didn't see a whole lot of that. We only saw it when it hit a crisis level, right? And we saw it very frequently when there were questions about like what it is our students need in an academic sense, what the curriculum should do for them. And those conversations among the faculty about the curriculum very often begin from, I mean, for all of the obvious reasons, the faculty perspective on what is important to know in my field, right? In order to know my field, you must know all the things that I do. And so I am going to construct a major for you that replicates the way that I was taught and conveys to you the most important things that I think are important about the field. And it has always seemed to me that we could construct a far better, more robust, richer curriculum if we actually talk to the students to find out, like, what are you interested in being an English major for, right? What is it you want from this? What does the English major feed in you? What is it you hope that you could take that degree and go off and do later on? Why English? And work with the students to really hear their responses and to think about what we could do to build a student-centered curriculum that really served them more than serving our need to transmit a particular quantity or quality of knowledge, right? And so I think that in some ways in student affairs, y'all are doing that all day, right? I mean, you're working with the students, you're hearing what the students need. But I think that there are times when, I mean, particularly in situations where resources are strained and needs outstrip those resources, where it can be really hard to feel like we're sort of failing to fulfill all of the needs that the students have. One of the things that's happened around here, I don't know the situation at UCSD, but at MSU, as you know, over the last couple of years, we've had a really major crisis around sexual assault on campus. And that has produced a serious strain on mental health resources and on ensuring that students feel protected and that the institution is not protecting itself at their expense. And we have not succeeded in really transforming that relationship in the way that we need to. And what I would love to see is, I wish I knew how to say this better, but an environment created in which the administration that is understandably working with restricted resources and a restricted ability to provide services to support students in need could hear from the students about how they might restructure those services in order to fulfill the needs better. So I think a lot of this, again, comes back to a willingness on the part of those of us who have authority, who know the program, who have the institutional requirements firmly in view, to listen first to those that we're attempting to serve and figure out what they genuinely need and how we can put that into practice and how we can work with them to put it into practice rather than working at cross purposes.
Thank you. Yeah, it seems that this year there has been more collaboration than ever, thankfully, with faculty and staff and students. And I know that all of us here at UCSD know, but the idea of being student-centered is at the forefront of all of our minds. So thank you for that. And I'm sorry to everyone that submitted questions. They're all so good, but we just don't have any more time today. And I'm so sorry. But if you have any parting words, Dr. Fitzpatrick, while we have you here, thank you again so much for coming. Or any advice for our colleagues as they enter a new year that is hopefully just a little bit brighter.
Oh God, may it be indeed. I just want to say thank you again for having me. Thank you for the questions, and thank you, Kirby, for the conversation. I think this has been really, really wonderful. I am excited for you about the program that you have in front of you today. I hope it is restorative and fulfilling, and I hope you come away from this day really feeling that brightness that's ahead. So thank you again, and all of you take care.
Thank you. All right, and I'll turn it over to Renato.
So at this time, on behalf of VCSA, I'd like to thank Dr. Fitzpatrick for agreeing to speak with us today and for sharing her expertise and insight. She has given us some great things to think about, which is a wonderful way to kick off the day. So again, we thank her for her time and all of you for attending. At this moment, we'll go ahead and break off into our respective sessions. You all should have received today's guidebook containing a brief description of each session, as well as the corresponding Zoom links. However, if you did not, I'm going to drop that into the chat so you can feel free to pull it from there. Do know that this Zoom session will remain open as the main room for the conference. So if you have any questions or issues, a member of the Professional Development Committee will be here throughout the day. So feel free to pop back in should the need arise. And with that, we'll now go ahead and break up into those sessions. And I wish you all a great day of professional development. Cheers.